This is a novice level talk, primarily for people who have not configured logging before. If you have configured logging before, you're probably not going to get a whole lot out of about the first half of this. So set an alarm and wake yourself up in about 25 minutes. All right, so logging, not just for lumberjacks. I am from the Pacific Northwest, and this is one of the things that we are known for up there. There's not going to be any plaid in this talk, though, I promise. Okay, so Impress did this really awesome thing to me where it rearranged a bunch of my slides as I was like closing this up on my way to come down here. So I may have to skip some of these. Pardon me. All right, we'll skip that one because that's out of order. So you may be wondering, why do you even want logs? Well, maybe you want to know that your database restarted. Perhaps somebody did this and you were not aware of it. Maybe you work with some people who like to play practical jokes on each other. I call this preemptive heckling, by the way. Maybe you work with people who are clumsy. This is always fun. So you want to know about these things when they happen, and a great way to find out about that is in your Postgres activity log. So obviously, it's a historical record of events like we just saw up there. It can be an awesome troubleshooting aid. Somebody calls and says, hey, I haven't been able to get into the database since 8 o'clock this morning. You can go back to your activity log and see if maybe something happened then. You may also have a legal requirement to keep these, keeping track of who's in your database and who's changed things, and sometimes even who has just looked at data. Hi. All right, so the basics. Something really cool about Postgres is that logging is not actually enabled by default when you get it. And we can discuss the positive or negative aspects of that at the bar tonight because that's kind of outside the scope of this talk. It's really super simple to turn it on, though. All you do is go into your PostgreSQL.conf, which I hope you know where that is. It should be in PG data, PostgreSQL.conf. And you just change this one parameter to on. And then, of course, you have to schedule to restart your database, but that shouldn't be that big of a deal, we hope. So that's all there is to it, except for these two other things where you need to know where to find your logs and what they're called. Logs are, as I said, going to be in PG data, PG log, and they will, by default, be named PostgreSQL something or other .log. And these are also controlled by parameters in PostgreSQL.conf, named, appropriately enough, log directory and log file name. So the last thing that you need to know about this default logging here is about log rotation. You don't want your logs to just keep getting bigger and bigger and bigger and bigger, one huge file. You want to have them in manageable chunks so that you can do things with them in a timely fashion, and also perhaps get rid of the old stuff. So Postgres will also take care of this for you by default. There's log rotation age, which by default is set to a day, and log rotation size, which by default is set to 10 megs. If you have both of these configured, which you do, what's going to happen is your logs are going to flip over once a day at midnight, or when they get to be 10 megs in size, whichever comes first. So you can see here that everything was ticking along just fine, and then all of a sudden, last Wednesday or whatever that is, I have a whole bunch of 10 meg log files going on. So obviously something is happening, and maybe I should look at that. Ideally, my alerting systems have already told me something is going on, but this is something else you want to keep an eye on. One small thing you do need to keep in mind, Postgres does not delete any of your old log files. So you're just going to keep getting more and more of these in this directory, and eventually you'll have a zillion of them. So don't forget to go in and clean that up too. So this is what you will get in your logs from those examples that we saw at the beginning with the database restarting and then me adjusting Magnus's salary for him and accidentally dropping a table. The defaults in what you receive are super duper conservative. You are not in any danger of getting what we call logorrhea. So you would be just fine if you are the poor schlock that the DBA quit and you are taking over his job and you really don't want to deal with this. If all you do is just configure your logging collector and keep track of how many logs you're getting, you're going to be way ahead of the game. So, recap, this is what we just did, except for this truncate on rotation, which I kind of glossed over there. You want to just cut the log off and start a new one. That's all that does. All right, so that is probably, that's enough for just about, like most generic purposes. But for me, I want a lot more detailed information. So we're going to go and we're going to customize it after I get a drink here. So in PostgreSQL.conf, there are 3 main sections related to your logging: what to log, where to log, and when to log. And then there are some other kind of random parameters strewn throughout. But those first 3 are the main ones that you really want to be concerned with. As I mentioned, the default values are pretty conservative. You can kind of leave them alone or just go one side or the other of them for starters while you're figuring out what you want to get. Most of the parameters just require a reload so that it'll reread the configuration file. Others require a restart, but those are all clearly noted in PostgreSQL.conf. And also, since I think 9.1, if you just reload your config and the parameter that you changed actually requires a restart, you'll get a log message that said, well, you changed this, but you actually need to restart the database instead of just reload. If you have logging configured, and aren't you glad you do? Because you just did. All right, so in the what to log section, this is who connected and disconnected. If I want to know what has changed, like if somebody went in and dinked around with my DDL, and I also want to have a special format for my log messages. This is the section of the PostgreSQL.conf that I'm going to use to configure that. So who connected? And again, okay, this may be more information than you want to have. These are things that I want to know, especially if I have a pretty small user base. I want to know who's logging in and who's logging out. Pretty obvious. Turn log connections and log disconnections on. And these are the sorts of messages you get from that. It tells me the username and the database and how long they stayed connected. And also, if they swap from one database to another, it'll give me another message about a connection. So it's not like they just connected to the cluster and I only get one message when they connect there and disconnect. Each time they connect to a database, I'll get a message about that. All right, what's changed? This is a pretty big one for me. The default for this is none. The DDL value is going to log a message anytime someone goes in and makes an update to your schema, your table definitions. Mod is for any changes to your data, inserts, updates, deletes. And all is everything. All's a little too much for me under all circumstances. I like to use mod sometimes. I would say to put this at DDL at a minimum so you know if someone has gone in and changed something on you. And that's what these look like. You get a log message that someone updated the employees table with, Magnus's new salary that he doesn't know about yet, or someone dropped the employees table entirely. All right, logline prefix. So I'm kind of a nerd, and this is actually one of my favorite parameters to mess around with. I did not show all the possible values on here because there are a lot of them. My personal favorite to use here is this %t down at the bottom. It's this %t, which is timestamp, %d, which is database, u, user, r, which is remote host and port, and then %%. And the reason I do that is because my background is in network management, and this makes a Postgres log message look like a Cisco log message, so that I can just kind of throw it in whatever I'm using to look at my Cisco logs. So this is the way this pans out here. Same thing we were looking at before. Database, username, remote host, and port, and then the same log messages. So you can see you can start like matching stuff up, and people are going to leave you a little trail with everything that they're doing in there. And you'll be able to put that back together by looking at your logs. So this one about resolving the host name, you do have to use log host name and turn it on, and this will turn your IP address into a name. And I did actually used to have a server named Fabio. I don't anymore. I'm very sad. There is a little bit of extra overhead with this one, obviously, because it's got a name lookup for you. I like to have that. Just makes things a little bit easier at 2 in the morning when you're trying to figure out a problem. So, recap of what to log. Connections on, disconnections on, mod, and your log line prefix. This is kind of the default that I will set up just generically when I'm starting out. So, next session, when to log. There are a few values in there about message levels, and there's one about long queries, which is really the more important one. The message levels are, your standard, like, debug is a whole lot of information, like, hi, I'm still here, blah, 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 on down to fatal is they're not going to, the database isn't going to tell you anything until it's falling over. These levels are not standard across all of these different log types for log client or logman error statement. And what I decided was the defaults are pretty much okay. I messed around with these a lot and just never really got that tweaked appropriately. If you turn up client min messages, it's going to send you stuff when you're in the PSQL command line, and I found that extremely annoying. So I just ended up leaving those alone. So don't ding with them. Logman duration statement. This one is a lot more fun. Set to -1, which is off. If you set it to 0, it is going to log every SQL query that goes through your database. What most people use it for is to look for queries that are taking an awfully long time. The units are in milliseconds, so you can say 2,000 would be 2 seconds. I like to write mine with a unit on there, and it's S for second, M for minutes, H for hours if you want to go that long. And you'll get a statement in your logs that tells you how long it ran and the query. Am I going too fast on the slides? Are you guys keeping up? OK. So you may be wondering, we have this log min duration statement that's going to log queries that take a long time. But before, I set up log statement. So what happens if we have both of them together? Well, the duration ends up getting printed, and the statements ends up getting printed separately. So you have to somehow match those up together. And going back to our log line prefix value from before, this %p value, that's PID. And you can use these two here to match those up. Figure out which statement is taking you too dang long. So, where to log? This is where things start getting kind of hairy, but fun. You basically have 4 choices: event log, CSV log, syslog, and standard error. And I have made this handy-dandy flowchart for you. Very simple. Please notice the disclaimer at the bottom, grossly oversimplified and not for production use. Basically, if you're on Windows, you want to use event log. If you want to load your messages into a database for later parsing, remember in the keynote this morning, he was talking about we just want to dump this data into the database and decide what to do with it later? CSV log. If you want centralized logging, you're probably going to be better off using syslog. Anything else, if you just don't want to dink with it, standard error. So, event log. With Windows behaves a little bit differently than Postgres on Unix. You're going to get the service start-stop messages by default, regardless of if you have logging enabled or not. You edit your PostgreSQL.conf pretty much the same way that you would on Unix. And then you just have to either restart or reload You can restart it via the services menu or reload the config with pgadmin. And then you go and use Event Viewer to view your messages. And I like to set up a custom filter just to kind of reduce the noise because it is super duper chatty. And that's about all I have to say about event logging on Windows. If you need more help with that, you can see me after this or at the Code Sprint on Thursday, because I will be there. All right, so standard error. Yes, this is a review because this is what we've been using from the beginning. Standard error is the default value. You've got the Postgres logging collector that handles all of this stuff for you. Now, the log rotation, remember I said the age and the size, it's going to rotate based on whichever one of these it hits first. You can disable you can disable the size by setting that to 0, and then it's only going to rotate every day, if that's what you want. So, standard error, this is a fun little problem I ran into. You've got to make sure that your user has permissions on the log directory that you want to send logs to in case you change that away from the default. Otherwise, you're going to get this fun little message, and the database isn't going to start. And it won't be logged because your database didn't start. Good things about standard error. It's super easy. Postgres handles the log rotation for you. The problems that I have with it are if you want to do any kind of centralized processing on your logs, you're going to have to make arrangements to send them off somewhere else. And you need to clean up the old logs yourself. But that's not really that hard. You know, a simple shell script will do it with find and xargs. Also not necessarily recommended for production use. So, CSV log. Notice that this looks very similar to the configuration for standard error. Awesome. So all you have to do is change standard error to CSV log and restart. Is that a restart or a reload? I think that one's a restart. And it looks like this. Isn't that fun? Yeah. So, okay, a couple things about this. The log file name, even if you still have it set to have a .log extension, it's actually going to change it to .csv. And I did not know about that and assumed that it was going to be named log and kind of expected my log processing to keep running in the background. And 3 days later, I said, you know, that's really weird. This isn't working anymore. And I went and looked, and it was because it had changed. So I think that's actually in the docs now, but that's kind of an interesting little gotcha. Logs from PEM. Aren't we excited? Yes. So, again, whoa, hello. What just happened? Okay. Again, similar to standard error, Postgres handles the log rotation for you. Yay. You do get a lot of cool stuff without extra effort. There's going to be PID, there's application name, there's timestamp, there's the timestamp the query ran, there's the status, there's all kinds of neat stuff in there. And loading logs into a database is a snap because it's CSV. Cons, again, the first two are like the cons with standard error. You still need to ship your logs if you want to do centralized processing, and you need to clean up the old logs yourself. I kind of have a love-hate relationship with CSV log. There are times when it's so awesome, and I'm like, yes, I'm so glad we have it, and other times when I'm just super annoyed by it. And one of the reasons that I find it super annoying is because the logs are not really human readable anymore. You know, that wall of text that I had up there? So no matter what happens, no matter what fancy reporting tools you have, at some point you're going to have to go and read a log and find something in it. And at 2 o'clock in the morning or 3 o'clock in the morning, I don't want to be trying to do that with the CSV log format because it's just, for me, it's just so hard to read. Yes, I'm going to be, sorry, that was really loud. Yeah. Yes, inside voice. I'm going to talk about that later on in the tools a little bit. All right, syslog. I use this one an awful lot. It takes a little more configuration on the Postgres backend, but for me it's just easier to handle overall. Just change your destination to syslog. And logline prefix I'll talk about last. Syslog facility, if you are not the owner of the machine that is going to receive your log messages, you will want to talk to the admin of that machine and have them tell you what facility they want you to log to. It'll be something like local 0, local 2, local 3, because you can make a pretty big mess if they're already receiving logs from other places. So, logline prefix, I tend to leave mine the same with the timestamp in it. And, okay, that's my slide's gone. Okay, that is kind of not really recommended because the syslog daemon is already going to put a timestamp on your log message. I like the added security of having 2. Because, if I'm shipping my log to a server that's in Central Time and my database is in Eastern Time and I'm on the West Coast and I'm sitting there going, when did this thing happen? I just like having the timestamp of the database server on there as well. So, pros of syslog, the centralized logging piece is pretty easy. You can leverage existing systems. You won't necessarily have to put anything extra in there. You can do some fun stuff with syslog ng or rsyslog, but those kind of have their own inherent headaches with them. Cons, of course, it requires access to syslog.conf. You kind of have to be the admin of your machine. And you will need to provide log rotation yourself. But that's also easily available on Linux with logadm.conf, which also will handle aging out old files so you don't have to do cleanup. So if you're getting the impression that you kind of need to mess around with these things and move the different dials around and see how you can get something that does exactly what you want, you're exactly right. There is no one-size-fits-all solution here. Oh, there's my thing. OK. There's been discussion that syslog has higher overhead than the native Postgres logging. I have not personally benchmarked it myself, so I can't really speak to that. And again, yes, I put a timestamp on my messages, and the docs do recommend that against that, so use that one at your own risk. All right, so to recap what we've been looking at so far, we've got connections, disconnections. I want to know if anybody's modified my DDL. I want to have my fancy schmancy logline prefix. I want to know if any queries run longer than 5 seconds, which is actually really, really short. You probably want to have it more like 5 minutes. And where to log is entirely up to you. So other stuff that you can configure. This is no longer the novice area. This is here's what you have to look forward to in the advanced class slide. You can log checkpoints if you want. I don't usually bother because you'll get a message if checkpoints start happening too fast. You can log auto vacuums that last longer than a certain amount of time and get all kinds of groovy stats about that as well, like how many pages it freed up and stuff like that. You can also change the log error verbosity. There's the default, which is what we've been looking at. And I think it's brief, and then there's a verbose. Some of the messages, it makes a difference. Some of them, it doesn't. So, play around with that one, too. But again, that's the more advanced. That's the logging 102 class. So what happens if you decide that 5 seconds you have set for your logmin duration statement is not actually long enough for what you're working on right then, but you don't want to go back in and change PostgreSQL.conf and reload the database and all that kind of stuff? Well, you can override that from PSQL with your standard environment PSQL variable syntax here. You just say set whatever the configuration parameter value is equals 2 minutes, although that may actually be set, there may be 2 instead of an equal sign there. Bad slide. if you don't feel like going out and looking at your PostgreSQL.conf, and maybe you're one of those people, or maybe you're following up after someone who doesn't save the default values in the configuration file, if you want to know what you have, this is a nice little query to run to find out what your logging settings are. And I will be posting my slides on the conference website. So, all right, tools to look at your logs. This is actually an old sawmill that's about 50 miles east of Portland. They've got this cool old restaurant with all kinds of old logging equipment set up out there. Not OSHA approved, by the way. All right, so you've got logs, and they're awesome. Now what? Use your eyeballs. I'm totally serious. At some point, you are going to have to, in the middle of the night, go read something. And why try to learn to do that in the middle of the night? Learn it in the afternoon. If you got 5 minutes to spare, go through your logs, see what's in there. I go through mine periodically and say, that's a really weird message. I've never seen that before. Why did I not notice that in my daily report? Find out some interesting stuff there. And maybe get warned of problems before they happen. Obviously, the Unix utilities like tail and grep and sed and cut and awk and split are going to be your friends here. All right, throw it into a database like we were talking about before. This is really, really dead simple. In the docs for the logging parameters, they give you the SQL statement to create the table to hold your CSV logs. You have to make sure that you're looking at the docs for your version of Postgres because they have added a field, and I think it was in 9.1, but it might have been 9.0. So you just need to make sure you've got the right version. And then it's just copy from the file into the database. Do you need more information than that? Okay, come talk to me afterwards. Okay, good. So as far as automated reporting, you can roll your own. For many years, I had a Cisco log parser that I used, which is part of the reason I tend to make my logs look like Cisco logs, because I could just throw them at that other log parser and bang, I'm done. How awesome. Generic logging, and by generic, I mean tools that handle all kinds of stuff. Splunk and Logstash are the two that I've tinkered with the most. And there are a couple of Postgres-specific tools, pgfluene and pgbadger, which I'll be talking about here in a moment. Oh, here we go. Look at this. A little more information for you. OK, application field was added in 9.0. So this is all you got to do. It really is disgustingly simple. And if you're going to do any kind of automated parsing, I've found that logging to CSV and then storing it in a database is probably the best way to do it, because you do get all the groovy stuff. By the way, you can log to multiple locations. You can log to CSV log and standard error. However, you got to deal with having the storage of that and potentially the overhead from that. I have not benchmarked that on any large systems yet, so I can't tell you if that, how bad that would be, but I've done it a little bit. Robert, you're nodding your head. Oh, Rob? Have you done that, Rob Walsh?
So, question?
Yes.
What happens if you run out of disk space? Postgres freak out horribly?
That's a really good question, and I have not actually had that happen to me. I got very close, but I got a phone call and managed to rescue it. Treat. Awesome. Okay, so for the recording, Robert Treat just shared an excellent story as usual. Postgres will not freak out if the log files are on their own file system. It'll just keep going on, but you will not have logs past a certain point in time. Right, so, and as I said, one of the cons for me is that the logs aren't human readable in CSV log. But you can do really fun things like this. FNNLC, the Friday Night Life Club. I had to put a little explanation of what that was because nobody knew last time I gave this talk. Yes, this is what I sit around and do when I'm bored. Okay. Yeah, so all I was doing was grouping up different log messages by their error level. And, good times. Obviously, something happened somewhere around like 4 o'clock. All right, so generic tools, Splunk and Logstash. I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on these. Splunk, basically, Splunk costs money, a lot of money. Logstash is an open source implementation of Splunk. Both of them are extremely easy to install. Both of them will require some tweaking to handle Postgres logs. You can definitely get your logs into the tools and do basic indexing on them, but as far as searching specific fields, which is really where the power of Splunk and Logstash come in, that can get kind of difficult. If you already have these solutions in your production system, sure, give it a whirl. See, okay, so I apologize. This is Impress reorganizing my stuff for me. All right. Next couple of tools are Postgres specific. pgfouine and pgbadger. And you've probably already heard of pgfouine. It is a Postgres specific log parser. It's written in PHP, and I do not believe that it works on Postgres past 8.4. One of the complaints about it is that it's pretty slow with larger logs. I had a friend who had, I think, a 46 million row file. It was something ridiculous, but it was taking Fouine like 6 hours to read his logs. I don't want to denigrate Fouine at all, though. It's an awesome tool. It saved me a lot of trouble and has served the community very well. It is now being sort of replaced by pgbadger, which is also a Postgres log parser. It's on GitHub. This one's written in Perl. And if you have not done log reporting before, you should probably just go ahead and start out with this one. It is really easy to make the switch. They both have pretty much the same requirements in terms of specific log formats. This is just the difference in the commands that you would use to generate pretty much the same report. Obviously, the Badger one's a lot shorter, just because Badger has its default set to report on most of the stuff that you have specified there for Fouine. So both of them have pretty decent documentation. Both of them will run from the shell, so you can put them in cron and get a report every hour or every day or every week or whatever you want. The reports are reasonably good looking, and they're portable. You can pick them up because the CSS is included in the HTML file. You can pick them up and put them on another server without worrying about anything breaking, which is actually pretty important to me. Cons, as I mentioned, Fouine can be kind of slow on larger logs. I have a 1.5 or 1.6 gig file that I was parsing, and Fouine was taking about 17 or 18 minutes to do it. Badger took 6. They both took about 90% of my CPU while they were doing this. But obviously, it's better to have that happen for 5 minutes than 18. Yes, Rob Walsh. It was a VM, so single. It was a very small VM, probably underpowered. They both require a specific logline prefix. You got to have a timestamp and then a PID, and that's so it can match up multi-line messages. You can kind of put whatever you want after that, though. You just have to have that piece first. The main caveat, though, you cannot have multi-line messages from standard error. They both do great with CSV log. It's another vote for CSV log. And they both do this funny thing where in their report, they'll reformat your syntax. If you're one of the people that writes your SQL all in lowercase, it's going to reformat into like select blah-de-blah into blah-de-blah. So if you have a tendency to grep for things in your logs, keep that in mind because it's not going to look the same in your report as it does in your logs. And neither of them recognize these kinds of messages. which may or may not be a big deal for you. It spits this out, so save the output. All right. Further tweaking. Do you guys, I actually have sample PG Fuine and PG Badger reports on here, which I can show you. We can do that now, or we can go through this and then I can go back and show you. I've not had good luck switching out of Impress to look at other things and then getting back into Impress where I was. So is everyone okay with skipping that and going, okay. 4:30, okay. Ooh. All right. These are like fun little extra things that I like to tinker with. This is new in 9.0, so I guess it's not really new anymore. It was new last year when I gave this talk. One of those other little percent variables holds the SQL state error code. It's a code that you can look up, and sometimes you can find out a bit more about whatever error message you're getting. So this is the error in my logs, the two on the console format there, and these are what it translates as. Sometimes it gives you more information, and sometimes it's completely inscrutable. So, your mileage may vary. If you want to make a change for a certain user, like HR calls you up and says, find out what Gabrielle is doing all this week in the database, you say, okay, and you can change just that user to log all of that user's statements, even if your regular log statement is set to just DDL or whatever. This can only be changed by a super user as well. If you are a user and you try to change this for someone else, it'll act like it changed it for you, but it didn't actually. You just don't get an error message about it. Auto-explain. This is actually one of my favorites, probably because it is also a foot gun. It will automatically run explain on every query. It's kind of like logmin duration statement. You specify a specific value a specific minimum value. Every query that takes longer to run than that will spit out some explain output into your logs. You do have to install it. And I actually had to hunt around for installation instructions. I'd never actually installed a contrib module before, so you have to do the usual make install steps there. And then you have to do a little bit of reconfiguration with your PostgreSQL.conf as well. This is the important one right here. Explain logmin duration. And again, this is just like logmin duration statement. It's in milliseconds. Please provide a unit like I didn't do there. Or you can just load it from the command line if you want to use it in just that session. And then you have your list of queries in a nice SQL file, and you run it interactively. And it'll spit out explain detail for you. If you're not familiar with explain, this is basically what the query planner thinks it should do to best execute your query. Now, obviously, since this was the original query, my log messages, it's going to really increase the size of your logs, which is why I call it a foot gun. This is not something that you want to turn on Friday afternoon and think, well, I'll collect data over the weekend. I mean, you can, but you might be very unhappy come Monday morning. So one last little caveat about this. If you use create user or alter user from the PSQL command line and just enter a clear text password, it's going to put that password in the logs just like that, because it's going to log that statement. Let's use this one instead, /password. All right, so safety first, except this is really safety last. I really like managing my Postgres.conf files, both of them, pghba.conf and PostgreSQL.conf in Git, and writing coherent commit messages. This just makes it so much easier if I do something that I decide later was dumb. I don't have to think about what did I do wrong. I can just roll it back and reload my database. And as Robert was saying before, definitely put your logs on their own partition. This is not necessarily recommended in the docs. I personally highly recommend that you do that, any kind of logs, actually. And don't tinker around with your settings and leave for the weekend, especially if it's auto-explain. And monitor your monitoring. keep track of how big your log files are. And if all of a sudden they're getting bigger, go in and find out what's going on. And don't let yourself run out of disk space. So, all right, so that's it. We're now ready to go to our log rolling contest. If you want a more in-depth view of this, check out Greg Smith's talk tomorrow. It's at 1:30. I don't remember which room it's in. All right, thank you very much. I will be at the Code Sprint on Thursday if you want to come talk to me. But now let's go look at Fouine. Okay, awesome, we're doing great. So, okay, Fouine and Badger, can you tell them apart? Kind of. Well, one of them says PG Fouine and one of them says PG Badger. But they both give you essentially the same report. You've got clickable links at the top, overall stats, hourly stats, queries by type, slowest queries, yada, yada. The things that I find the most interesting are these with the N, queries that took up the most time, N, most frequent, et cetera. These are normalized. And it'll just say like commit and whatever, and they've got these little empty quotes in here. And you can say show examples, bang. And it'll show you the examples of the queries that we're taking all this time here. So, also tells you how long these ran and the file it came from. So this was 45,000 entries in 3 seconds. And let's see what Fouine thinks it did. I think I used the same ones. Oh, it doesn't tell me the number. That's not it, number of queries. Oh, this 1 million. Oh, this is the one from my friend that was taking so long. Awesome, 1 million queries. Hourly stats, queries by type. There's an awful lot of inserts going on here. If that's normal, sure. So one of the things you want to do when whichever reporting tool you decide to use is examine these periodically, especially when you're starting out. Figure out what looks normal for you so then you can recognize what is abnormal later. So that is about all I have, and we have about 5 minutes left for questions. Anyone have any questions? Why is the sky blue? Okay, awesome. Well, thank you very much. And if you need more help with any of this, come see me at the Code Sprint.